Book 4, Falcon in the Barn, Chapter 15. Seeing as how some people weren't where they were supposed to be. Perrin evaluated the 11 men surrounding the map, just as dawn peeked over the horizon. Most of them had a couple hours of sleep, but it wasn't enough. The map was now on the ground of the command tent to afford every man a clear view, with the colonel towering over almost all of them. Look, maybe we should do the briefing individually. No! Gary Jordan called feebly from his horizontal position on a litter. He made an attempt to slap the side of the tent in emphasis, but the canvas merely gave way. Sir, his assistant next to him on the ground held up his hand. The major smacked that instead. Well landed, Burke, he said, pleased with the smacking effect. He looked up to Perrin, who was trying to hide his smile. We started this together. We finish together. Brillin Karna, also on the ground, nodded wearily. He was propped up against a stump on his left with Shem on his right, who sat next to him as support. Brillin's normally light brown face was pale from loss of blood, and his leg was bandaged extensively. Still, he proclaimed, albeit weakly, "Hear, hear." Out of loyalty, the officers' assistants also sat on the ground, taking notes and offering support to their injured commanders. Perrin glanced at Grayson Fod, the only other uninjured officer standing next to him. Fod shrugged. Whatever they want, sir. Only a faint moaning sound came from the vicinity of Lemuel Thorne. He was slumped awkwardly on the other side of Zenas, his head propped up slightly against Shem's arm, but lolling back and forth as he moved in and out of consciousness. Shem leaned toward Brillin in a pretense to help him sit more comfortably, and the young captain flopped to the ground with another groan. Shem quickly looked around apologetically at the other soldiers, on his face an overly dramatic expression, worthy of the amphitheater that conveyed, "Ooh, did I do that?" Several men snorted. Perrin shook his head slowly at Thorne. How much sedation did they give him anyway? Shem grinned slyly. It seems our brave captain has a thing about needles. When he heard how much stitching the surgeon planned to do, he nearly passed out all on his own. He asked for as much sedation as possible so he wouldn't feel anything for a very long time. That's why he's not entirely with us yet. Perrin shook his head again, trying to dislodge tempting thoughts of how they could test just how much or little pain the captain could feel right now. The notion of dropping him from varying heights was presenting itself in his mind when he noticed Brillin gesturing slowly. "Colonel," his frail voice came as forcefully as it could, "don't criticize sedation until you've experienced it. That stuff is a miracle, and you know I don't believe in miracles." The only man in the tent who knew just how much sedation the colonel had experienced found, at the most opportune moment, the strength to keep his face completely somber. "And a hear, hear to that," Jordan called from the floor. His assistant held up his hand again for the major to smack. "Days of planking are over." What was so bad about being planked? Perrin asked. Jordan tried to push himself up into a sitting position, but he cringed in pain and collapsed. Perrin winced in sympathy. The major's arm wasn't the only thing injured. He took a deep dagger plunge into his upper back thigh, and he wanted to make sure everyone referred to the location of his injury that way as well, when he startled one of the last guarders hiding in an abandoned bedroom. If Jordan tried to lie on his side to relieve the pressure on his thigh, his injured arm had to support his weight. If he shifted to the other side, then his thigh bore his weight. The only option was to lie on his stomach, which Gary refused to do, claiming it wasn't dignified. The other officers had a bet as to when he would finally relent. Perrin guessed by midday meal. Now the major tried propping himself against his ever-ready Burke, who struggled to find a way to support Jordan without inflicting more discomfort. Burke offered him his knee to lean against. For about a minute, Gary would be comfortable. "Shin, have you ever been planked?" Jordan asked from his semi-prone position. Brillin and Shem both began to chuckle. Perrin ignored them. Yes, maybe a couple of times. Shem chortled. Maybe a couple? Brillin jabbed him in his side and coughed back his own laugh. Well, each time they hit me over the head to knock me out for stitches, I wake up with a headache worse than the pain of stitching, Jordan declared. With sedation, I wake up only groggy, as if I just had a bad jug of mead. Since I'm used to that from my command school days, I'll take sedation over planking any day. Perrin nodded obligingly. I'll be sure to look into it if ever I need stitching again. Another low groan came from Thorne. Shem gave him a casual glance and waved at Perrin. He's fine. Best get on with your briefing before he's fully awake. He's got maybe 10 minutes. Heard that, moaned Thorne. Bet you won't remember it, Jordan chuckled. With any luck, Fod murmured, he won't remember a great many things. Colonel Shin cleared his throat, unsure of what to do about those many things. Additional wagons are on their way from Edge, he told the men in the tent. Because of the explosions, our casualty numbers are higher than we anticipated. But I send a messenger to Edge telling him of our situation. And my surgeon assures me we can care for all of the wounded in our training arena, provided we can borrow a few of your surgeons for a few weeks. The commanders nodded at that. So the wagons to head back to the fort will be those carrying the most severe cases first. Once the injured are taken care of, we'll use the wagons to retrieve the dead, likely this afternoon. Fod and I will go to Moorland to oversee the retrieval of our fallen. Shem shook his head. You're not supposed to leave this farm, Colonel. Have you forgotten? You did so well last night staying where you should. Don't ruin it now. Several of the assistants smirked and looked down at the ground. Jordan's guffaw was so loud that Perrin saw the tent wall move. Thank you for the reminder, Zenas, Perrin said dutifully. Besides, Shem continued, I'm sorry to report that your horse is, unable to take you. Fod cleared his throat, as if Shem had just broken some agreement they had. Perrin squinted. Why? Shem shrugged an apology to Fod, who gently took Perrin's arm. We found it dead this morning. Exhaustion, maybe colic, we're not sure. I'm very sorry. Perrin exhaled and rubbed his forehead. Of course, there were more casualties than he anticipated, but the horse. He was even trying to think of a good name for it, too. That actually was the first decent animal I've had since I've been to Edge. You've never claimed a horse, Shin? Jordan was amazed. Request one. From the stables at Pools. Tell them what you want. Perrin sighed. Maybe I will. Well, there are still plenty of riderless horses today, and I fail to see how staying here now... You will stay here. Shem's tone was more forceful than Perrin had ever heard it. He glared. We'll discuss this later, Sergeant Major. Brillin found enough strength to say, You should stay here, Colonel. Let Zenas go with Major Fod. We need you here. Perrin sighed at the well-intentioned insubordination. He was being overruled at every turn. But they were also right. I've asked Rigoff to compile a list of the missing men, he said in resignation. He should have that completed within the hour. We will take that, those going to Moorland will take a copy of the list, along with the soldiers from each fort to help identify their dead, should their name patches be unreadable. He glanced around the tent. No one's seen Benef yet, have they? The men shook their heads. Shem stared off at a corner. Zenas, you went looking for him last night. Did you? No, sir, I didn't. I even went to the forest's edge. Perrin frowned. Was there any activity in the forest near our camp? Anything whatsoever? No guard or activity at all, sir. Shem looked him in the eye. The doddering old fool likely wandered back to the fort and was asleep in his quarters, Perrin decided. My goal, he continued, is to have the camp dismantled by tomorrow afternoon. I also want a team of volunteers to investigate the crater in Moreland. I want to know what happened there. Major Fod shook his head. I'm not sure that's a good idea, sir. There could be more of that black powder in smaller amounts somewhere in the area. I made sure the men touched nothing as they raided the houses. We don't need another explosion. I agree. That's why we can't leave it then, can we? Perrin said. As much as I'd like to believe we killed every garter last night, I know that's not the truth. What's to stop any survivors from returning for that substance and using it against us? Then burn whatever's left of Moreland, Jordan insisted. Pull out our dead and torch the place. Don't give anyone else a reason to settle there. Burke held up his hand for another Jordan slap. The rest of the men agreed loudly with the major until Colonel Shin held up his hands for quiet. I agree, we destroy the village. But first we should find out what caused the blast. The knowledge of how to create it may have escaped last night, and someone may be able to duplicate it somewhere else. If we know what it was, we may be able to fight it. Colonel, Shem said, how can we fight nature? What they did was a recreation of nature. You can't conquer that. You can only run from it. It will do us no good to pursue this. But Zenas, Perrin said, what if we recreate it ourselves? The air in the tent went deathly still. Find out the secrets ourselves, Shin? Zenas glared at him. And use it where? Who are you planning to annihilate, sir? Perrin felt the stares of nearly all the eyes in the room. Thorne's eyes remained closed, and the only sound was his faint, nasally snoring. Perrin held up his hands again. Just a thought. Shem shook his head. Get rid of that thought, Colonel. We shouldn't be copying the garters. We're better than that. Fod turned to Perrin. Sir, respectfully, I agree with Zenas. Let's just torch the remaining areas and hope that if the secrets did escape, those who hold them are too terrified by what happened. Fod, that's not the way the garters think, Perrin hissed at him. Nothing terrifies them. Colonel, Shem interrupted, we will put this to a vote if we must, but since you're confined by the administrators to this farm, and each of us has pledged to serve the administrators and follow their decrees and make sure you stay here, I don't see how you'll stop us from torching the village without us first finding its secrets. Now all the eyes turned and stared at the sergeant major, but his hard gaze was held by Perrin's equally cold one. Perrin had never seen Shem so adamant, nor so angry. We'll discuss this later, Zenas. I'll tell you what I'd like to discuss, Jordan said, trying to break the tension. Since you two will be discussing quite a bit on your own later, I'd like to discuss what kind of medal I should get for being stabbed in the upper back thigh. A couple of the men began to chuckle. In fact, I imagine there'll be quite a few medals handed out in the next few moons, Jordan declared. Consider what we've done, gentlemen. We're the first to find a garter holdout, wipe them out, and destroy their new weapon. I'm going to need stronger cloth to hold up the weight of all those new medals on my uniform. Now even Perrin was smiling, but stiffly. Actually, that is something we need to discuss. The report we send to Idemia. Yes, said Brillin thoughtfully, there may be a bit of a problem with that. Fod nodded. I agree. Just how much detail do we provide? He folded his arms and looked steadily at Colonel Shin. Seeing as how some people weren't where they were supposed to be. A fragile voice from the corner piped up. If he was where he was supposed to be, I wouldn't be here now. Thorn tried to roll over, but the 30 stitches in his side wouldn't let him. The words, "Don't remind me," nearly came out of Perrin's mouth. Thorn attempted to sit up, and Shem half-heartedly offered him a hand. "Indeed, Colonel Shin," Jordan smiled as he slowly slumped along Burke's leg. "For what you put together, the success we had, and your valiant personal effort on the field, I can't see how anyone could argue you don't deserve immediate promotion to general." His assistant already had his hand out, waiting for the slap. Karna, Zenas, and Fod grinned, and several of their assistants cried out, "Hear, hear!" Perrin knew he was turning red, but he couldn't imagine how to stop it. Then he had an idea. He looked at Thorn. The captain had struggled to a sideways sitting position, trying not to lean on Shem any more than necessary. He regarded the colonel with an expression Perrin couldn't quite decipher, but it seemed to be part worry, part defiance, and part admiration. "There will be no promotion for me, gentlemen," Perrin said quietly, meeting Thorn's unreadable eyes. "In fact, there'll probably be an extension to my probation for violating it so willfully. And as for planning the offensive in the beginning without the express permission of the hierarchy," he shook his head. Shem smiled at him. "Sir, probably the only thing that will keep you from being demoted to a measly private is that you saved the grandson of the High General of Idemia." Too bad. I could have outranked you," he said with a twinkle in his eyes. Thorn glanced sharply in his direction, but nodded. "Funny." Shem looked up as if searching for strength. "Any volunteers to write a report?" Perrin asked the officers. "You may have all of my notes, and my permission to relay the facts as best as you remember them," he said in a tone full of suggestion. "I'll do it," Fod said. "My men were the first to see them in Moreland. I sent the message to Karna, who contacted you, so I started it all. Let me finish it, sir." Perrin nodded at him. "Thank you, Major." A messenger arrived at the tent flap. "Sirs, the first wagons from Edge are arriving, along with a little extra help." He sent a wary look to Perrin. Perrin shifted the look to Shem, with an additional level of, "All right, Shem, what have you done?" Shem leaped to his feet, nearly knocking Thorn back down. "We have our orders, right, men? Fod, I'll need just a few minutes with the colonel before I join you for Moreland. Perhaps you can see to helping Thorn back to the surgeons." It was presumptuous of Zenas to issue suggestions, but every man in the tent could see something was up between him and Shin, and no one wanted to get in the middle of that. Fod nodded while Shem took a startled Perrin by the arm and pulled him out of the tent. "We need to talk." "That's right we do," Perrin growled at him. "This could be considered insubordination, and we weren't finished." "Yes, we were," Shem said dismissively. "More importantly, we need to talk about what happened last night. About you." He led a fuming Perrin to the edge of the woods, where the first wagons were pulling up in the large open area, the camp well behind them on the other side of the command tent. Shem murmured, "I know something happened with you. I saw it in your eyes when you came back last night. You also haven't slept enough, and..." Being henpecked by Shem was the last thing Perrin wanted. "Shem, I'm fine. And where are we going?" he added in annoyance. A wagon rolled to a stop in front of them, and he stiffened when he saw the extra help. Mari climbed off the side without waiting for assistance from the soldier who brought her. Jatsi and Pato jumped out of the back and stood by the wagon with eager but apologetic faces. "Ah, Shem," Perrin snarled. "What's she doing here?" Mari marched up to him. "Don't Shem him. This was my idea. You went out there, didn't you?" Perrin was furious. At least, that's what the emotion felt like. His wife, checking up on him as if he were a 12-year-old runaway. How absurd! But there she stood, hands on hips, her eyes severe as she gazed into his, until she softened. Perrin? He wasn't sure what she saw in his face, but the urge to grab her throat and check her pulse overwhelmed him. He took her wrist instead and dragged her past the edge of the forest into the shadows for some privacy. Her pulse quickened under his fingers as he sat her down on a fallen tree. Shem followed them in. Apparently this morning no one remembered Pear Shin's first rule about staying out of the forests, and he waited for the Shins from a little ways off. Yes, I went there, Perrin confessed, but I didn't get hurt. Mari, if it makes you feel any better, he was pretty good out there, Shem offered. So were you, Shem, Perrin said. I'm actually more worried about you. Last night you were very effective for once. More than once by my count. Shem looked down at a lone pine cone. I know. I had no choice. I'm working on that myself. Perrin took a deep breath. Well, add that to the list of things we're going to discuss later. We have enough to talk about for riding all the way to Waves. Now, I promise both of you that I had no problems during the battle. Mari looked deep into his eyes. But after? Perrin couldn't hold her gaze any longer. He sat down in the dirt in front of her and stared at a decaying log. There was no more images, but just the memory of the images, of smoldering, of Mari. Shem, he whispered, we can't let them ever use that weapon. Perrin felt his wife's arms wrap around him. Weapon? Tell me what— No! He exclaimed, pulling out of her embrace. He'd never tell her, especially here among the rotting wood that reminded him of burning limbs. I never want to see it again. He dared to meet her eyes and searched himself as she searched his face. He didn't feel the same as before. He was beating it right there. I can deal with it, he assured them, because Shem's going to destroy whatever remains. Mari turned expectantly to Shem, and he nodded back at her. Perrin took Mari's face. You shouldn't have come here. But you need us, she said. The children and I can help get the injured to the wagons. How long were you planning this? Ever since you told me what you were planning. Women don't belong out here. Prove it. He managed a short chuckle. I don't have time to debate you right now, woman. No, you don't, she agreed. But you do have a few seconds to accept my apology for checking up on you. She put her arms around his neck and kissed him. Of course, he had to be polite and returned the gesture. Shem groaned and turned around. Now, Pato, he called loudly, stay at the wagon, trust me. He murmured to himself as he ambled out of the trees. Yes, yes, advantages of marriage. You remind me all the time. Mari and the children proved to be more help than Perrin imagined they could be. While the surgeons and assistants attended to the more seriously injured, his family handled the minor cuts and changing of bandages. He was surprised that wounded men responded so cheerfully to his wife and son. Seeing another face besides a sour surgeon's seemed to be an effective treatment. But he was not at all surprised by the attention afforded his daughter. Soldiers who were barely injured suddenly needed Jatsi to rewrap a wound that had just been bound by an aide, or required her arm around their waists to walk them to a departing wagon, even though they had wandered over to the surgery area on their own. Perrin tried to stay nearby to shoot warning glares at the young men who happened to be lucky enough to have the beautiful— yes, Perrin had to acknowledge she had become uncomfortably stunning— beautiful young women notice their need. Soldiers from other forts who somehow missed the fact that her dark eyes, nearly black hair, and confident gait were identical to the colonel's were usually enlightened by Edge's men, although a few were allowed to naively try to sweet-talk her, just to see what kind of punishment the colonel, hovering behind, would impose on the hapless soldier. It was usually their rank yelled loudly in their face, followed by the words, "Would you like me to get a little bit closer to check your wound?" Perrin tried to steer Jatesy, who seemed innocent to the differences between smiling and leering, away from where Thorn was waiting to be loaded onto a wagon. But she happened upon him by accident, when Perrin was distracted elsewhere. Too late, Perrin turned to watch from several wagons away as Jatesy adjusted the bandages on a soldier, whose face she only glanced at with a practiced smile. One of the surgeons had asked her to rewrap the oozing wound 3 litters away, and her attention was focused on the blood, not the bleeder. Without his undershirt and jacket, and splattered with dirt and dried blood, Captain Thorn was not immediately recognizable to Jatesy, until he put a hand gently on her arm. She looked up with the same comforting smile she gave all of the soldiers, but then her face froze and her smile dissolved. Perrin took a quick step forward, but decided instead to observe from the distance. He could make it to her side with his fist ready in less than 2 seconds, and he'd rather hoped for the opportunity. He hadn't spoken to Jatesy about what happened between her and Thorn a few weeks ago. He needed her to keep her confidence in Shem, and now he wanted to see her reaction to Lemuel. He had a clear view of his daughter's eyes when she recognized Thorn. They bulged in anger, but she bit her lip and went back to fixing his wound, albeit more aggressively. Perrin beamed when Thorn flinched as Jatesy tightened the bandage around his ribs. But Lemuel still held her arm and squeezed it gently. She paused in her straining to really tighten that knot and shifted her hardened gaze to his face. He said something quietly, and Perrin's hand balled into a ready fist. Jatesy's face remained wooden, but she nodded slightly and went back to securing his bandages. That would likely require a knife to remove. She stood, glanced briefly in the direction of her father without fully seeing him, then turned to help the next soldier as Thorn's litter was hefted into the wagon. It would be hours until Shem returned to find out for Perrin what transpired between the two of them. At least seething over Thorn holding his daughter's arm, especially since he had told him just over 3 weeks ago to never touch her again, gave Perrin something else to think about instead of the burning at Moorland. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you.